Good afternoon. This is Lecture 5, Part 1. Today we're going to be applying the conflict and functional perspectives to more or less crime. Crime, laws, law enforcement, the correction system. This week we're going to start with the conflict approach. So I've broken this class down into about the steps of crime. Basically, laws have to be created first. Then you have somebody commits a crime. You have law enforcement getting involved. After the law enforcement gets involved, there's a legal system where you either go to a judge or there's plea bargaining, and last comes corrections. So there is a sequential order to today's lecture. So we're going to begin with the state, laws, and lawmakers. So I want you to think about the law and the lawmakers. So the state, you've probably heard this word before. Of course, we live in the state of California, and there's states like Virginia and New Hampshire. The state, when you think about it politically and sociologically, is defined as an organization that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of coercion and violence within a territory. This is a very famous definition from a sociologist named Max Weber. What does it mean? Well, it basically means the state is the only thing that can use violence legitimately. If a criminal is robbing a store using a gun, that is illegitimate violence. If a cop shows up to that store and shoots that guy in the head, that is completely legitimate in our society. We accept that the police can shoot somebody in the line of duty. We accept that our government can use lethal injection to kill somebody. That is legitimate. We don't look, some people in our society do argue that capital punishment is cruel and unusual, but for the most part, they're not running around saying that's the illegitimate use of violence. The state is allowed to use violence. The military is authorized to go and protect our nation against other foreign countries and such, but that's legitimate violence, and only the state can use violence. Well, we're going to think about this for a moment. We're going to look at the conflict and functional perspectives on the state. So this time we're going to start with the conflict perspective. The conflict perspective, going all the way back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, says that back in the day there was class warfare. There were the rich and there were the poor, as you've heard many times in this class. And what was happening was the poor started attacking the rich. Every once in a while there would be an uprising, and the poor would rise up and they'd kill a rich guy and his whole family, maybe his friends too. So the elite came along and said, the rich people came along and said, this isn't working for us. We're directly dominating the poor. If you were a lord and you had serfs, or you had, lowly farmers on your land, working the land, and you were exploiting those people, they would overthrow you. So the rich said, we need a way of having an organization that can sort of quash these rebellions without the poor people thinking it's us. So from the conflict perspective, the state was created because there was rich people and there were poor people. And the rich people did not want the poor people attacking them. So they created another organization called the state. So if the rich guy had a problem, he could call up a magistrate. The magistrate would come, he'd arrest the poor guy, throw him in jail, he would, cut off his hands, he would whip him, all sorts of things the state would do. But then the poor people would be mad at the state, not the rich guy. And according to Marx and Engels, this is why the state was created. It was created by the rich to serve the rich, and hide the fact that the poor are being dominated by the rich. The poor see the state as the enemy, when in reality, according to the conflict approach, it is the rich people who created it in the first place. I found this picture here. I think it's a great picture. They only call it class warfare when we fight back. The idea here is that a lot of poor people are not pushing back against the rich. Think about all of our political discourse right now. It's all about government. It's about Republicans and Democrats. Because there isn't class warfare going on in the United States. The poor do not see the rich as the enemy, at least not thoroughly, not throughout the country. A lot of people look at government and they point their anger at government rather than upper class. So I think this sign is pretty witty. They only call it class warfare when we fight back. And a lot of people do not. Well, that's Marx and Engels' theory on the origin of the state. Why do we have this organization that monopolizes violence? So let's talk about politics and sort of everyday life. The laws that are created now. Now that, we already have a state, what happens with politics? Why do we have these laws that we have? Well, some conflict theorists, some contemporary conflict theorists, have developed a theory called the power elite. According to this theory, there are three elite groups that overlap. There's the political elite, sort of the people in the executive branch, maybe the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Interior. You've got NSA, CIA type people. You've got the military elite. We're talking about 5-star generals, people at the top. And then you've got your economic elite. This is the corporate elite. The CEO of this company and the CEO of that company. According to this power elite theory, these are the people who really control lawmaking. And everything else we're seeing is sort of a facade. Looking at Congress and the Senate, that's all just window dressing to make us think that we have a democracy. When in reality, we have a power elite system. They control the laws, who has access to them. And the role of government is to sort of hide the fact that the power elite are in control. There's two authors, contemporary authors, who have written on the power elite. The first is C. Wright Mills. Mills is also the man who penned the idea, the sociological imagination, which we talked about in Chapter 1. He wrote a book called The Sociological Imagination, very important book for sociologists, and he is also the author of The Power Elite. That's a pretty old book. There's a newer author, I think he's at UC Santa Cruz, actually, University of California, Santa Cruz. His name is G. William Domhoff, and he wrote a book called Who Rules America? And he's updated a lot of these theories and looked at the elite and how they intermarry and they go to schools together, and then, maybe one guy is running a corporation and the other guy is in government and the other guy went in the military, and they're friends and they get together and they talk and they plan, what the United States government's going to do, and they sit on corporate boards of trustees and things like that. So we've just looked at the state, the laws, and the lawmaker. We're going to talk about crime today, but I wanted to start on, where do laws come from and who do laws benefit? According to the conflict approach, the whole state, the government, the laws, the lawmaking, it all is for the elite. It's for the haves, not the have-nots. They have created laws that serve their interest. So now we're going to talk about law enforcement. And law enforcement doesn't just enforce laws. They're also monitoring behavior. And they're monitoring some people's behavior more than others. So they're enforcing the law, they're monitoring behavior, and they actually generate statistics as well. So we're talking about police cameras that monitor people. We're talking about cash rewards for monitoring criminals. We're talking about police who are keeping their eyes on certain areas of town, not others. And we're talking about enforcement. When the police arrest people, bring them to jail, and possibly they end up going to prison. The conflict approach talks about monitoring, and they want to know what groups are monitored, where are people monitored, when are people monitored, and if you can think about monitoring people and who's being monitored and who's not, you can definitely develop your sociological imagination. The example I always use is domestic violence. Domestic violence looks very different in an upper-class home and in a poor inner-city home. And if you use your sociological imagination and imagine those two worlds, you can start to see why things turn out the way they do. In an upper-class home, if a man beats a woman, she goes to a private doctor, maybe a private doctor she's been going to for a long time. And she might be able to get away with, the doctor saying, asking a question about domestic violence, and she can brush it away. Again, if we're talking about a wealthy family, if this is a constant pattern of violence against the woman, she might be able to go to a different doctor every single time because she's got the money or the health insurance to do that. Private doctors might be less likely to report domestic violence because they look at the woman and they say, oh, what's her story? She's an upper-class woman. She's got money. She's got an education. That would never happen to her. Same thing when police come to a house where there's domestic violence and it's a wealthy family. How do those police approach that couple? How do they perceive that man? If he's a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or an advertising executive, how do they perceive that person? A lot of us are under the impression that upper-class guys don't beat their wives. Because when we watch television, we see cops, and it tends to be the guy wearing, a wife beater and with holes in it on meth. But there's some good reasons to believe that domestic violence happens just as equally in the upper class. If you continue using your sociological imagination, and you imagine the home of the upper class, a lot of upper class folks have a lot of privacy. Large homes, a lot of land, maybe walls around their big mansion. So they have a lot of privacy. If you switch all of those factors and think about lower income families, it's almost the complete opposite. If we're talking about privacy, lower income families tend not to have privacy. If we're talking about a large apartment with hundreds of apartment units in it, those walls are paper thin. If there is any sort of domestic disturbance, their neighbors are phoning in those calls and saying, hey, I hear the neighbors next door and they're yelling and screaming at each other. So there you go. It's being reported more because of the living circumstances. Poorer people living closer together. Well, let's say it's not reported by the neighbors and the woman goes to a doctor. Well, if you've got county doctors that are looking at a poor woman's wounds, they're going to report that. It's not the same as a private doctor. You've got county doctors. Now, don't get me wrong. All medical professionals are required to report suspected abuse. But I do want you to use your sociological imagination and think, are there pressures that these doctors are experiencing at the meso level where maybe they won't, or the micro level, or maybe the rich doctors won't report it and the county doctors will. It could go the other way too, but I'm inclined to believe that the county doctors, the person who's not being paid privately, is more likely to report it. What about the police? When the police show up to a working class home or apartment and they suspect domestic violence, how do they approach the situation? So what I'm trying to argue is when you look at domestic violence and you look at upper class and working class and you think about the different factors, the medical people who are involved, the privacy that they're afforded through their money or not afforded through their money, and how police interpret upper class and lower class people, well, you might get different outcomes, even though upper class homes are just as likely to have domestic violence.